of events that's coming up. What we're trying to do here is bring together a group of people who are doing work parallel to us in a way, doing restoration work, working in the environment. And so with great excitement, we have, looking forward to these talks. I'll tell you a little bit about ISOLA. Pradeep will tell you a little bit about the speakers next, but we can move to the next slide. So we are landscape architects. A number of you are in this room are also landscape architects. But for those of you who are not, I'll just sort of explain a little bit that we are, the ISOLA is the Indian Society of Landscape Architects. And landscape architects are a group of people who work with construction, sociology, environment, culture, and bring all these streams together to create outdoor spaces, that are meaningful to their user group, that are space efficient, cost efficient, and also sensitive to the natural environment. So what we try and do is really bridge the gap between architecture and the environment, mostly in urban settings, but also often in natural settings. And so one of the things that we are trying to do, I am the current chair of my name is Aditya Advani, and I'm the current chair of the Delhi ISOLA chapter. We have several chapters all the way across India. And one of the things that we thought would be really useful to do for our membership group, but for other people also, have an educational series on how restoration is happening, rewilding as it's called, is happening across India. So we may learn from it, and us landscape architects may incorporate these ideas and practices into our domain as well, so that we can also learn from the experts. So we turned to Mr. Pradeep Krishan. All of you know him. He doesn't need any introduction, but I'll just say that you can read it here. He's a very renowned person in so many different ways. And he has written some remarkable books for us that we use, landscape architects use in their daily practice. And so he's done a great service to us landscape architects by writing these books. And also he has a real inquisitive nature. He has looked into the issues of our environment, and he's done this kind of rather broad range thinking about the Indian environment. So, it's a really wonderful contribution he's made to the Indian environment. And so we turned to him to say, can you help us put together a set of panelists who will come together and explain to us the practice of rewilding and restoration. And so we put these series of talks together with the spirit of inquiry, with the spirit of learning. And we are hoping that and we've also done an immersive set of talks. So we're going to have talks twice a week for the next few weeks, Wednesdays and Saturdays. And the idea is we have an immersive experience. And just to let you know that this talk will go on as long as we need. The question and answer session can continue as we need. There's no limit to it. The Zoom session will continue. There's going to be no interruption. But in terms of Q&A, I'm sure a lot of you will have questions and answers. What we would like you to do is ask your own question. But what we want you to do is, as the talk goes on, you can write in the chat your name. And our secretary, Shwetal, at the end will call out your name. At that moment, you can please unmute yourself, ask your question, and then mute yourself again to hear your answer. Then once the answer is finished and the answer has been given, Shwetal will call to the next person. That way we will have an orderly kind of question and answer system. If your questions had already been asked, then I would ask you to change it to another question possibly. So with that, I will turn to Mr. Krishan, and he will tell us a little bit about how he's put together this set of panelists and what he hopes for from this particular set of discussions. I'm going to mute myself now. Thank you.
Thank you, Aditya. Thank you very much. I want to reciprocate by saying what a pleasure it's been to work with ISOLA's Delhi chapter, and how cooperative Aditya and Shwetal have been in helping to put this together. I want to start by calling out I'm reminding you that this is the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. It's a wonderful thing the UN has done. India has, some of you will know that India has actually committed, according to the Bonn Convention, to restore 30 million hectares of degraded land in the country. Sorry about that. How India is going to do this, I don't know. It doesn't have trained expertise to do this, certainly not in the forest department. And what's even more worrying is the fact that at a recent webinar, the government of India seems to have claimed that they have already restored 8 million hectares of land. Where these lands are, how they've restored them, with what is a complete mystery. So I just hope that the whole thing doesn't become a complete farce. I also want to call out a very interesting new international coalition of scientists and conservationists and NGOs and expert practitioners of rewilding that is called the Global Alliance, Rewilding the Global Alliance, which was meant to have had a huge convention in Jaipur last year, but because of the COVID thing, it didn't actually happen. But for those of you who are interested, they have a wonderful global charter for rewilding the earth. And if you want more information, then please note that their website is called info@rewildingglobal.org. Rewilding Global has 2 G's, Rewilding Global. So if any of you are interested in getting in touch with them or in reading the charter or in joining as members, please do take a look at the Global Alliance for Rewilding. I want to just say a few words about this, about why we thought it was important and useful to try and bring landscape architects together with people who do restoration work. In my opinion, there's a wide gulf that separates the practice of landscape architecture from ecological restoration, partly because I think there are very different ways of looking at plants and looking at landscapes. And part of this has to do with the fact that, at least in the limited spheres in which I have tried to understand the way landscape architecture is taught, students are not really taught about ecology at all. They're not taught about ecology. They're not taught about landscapes. They're taught to use plants almost like little features that you sort of stick into a, landscape architects are brilliant at drawing maps, right? At drawing plans. And plants tend to be just little features with which you decorate a map. And that is, in a sense, antithetical to the way ecological restoration people work, at least most of them. And I think that perhaps by trying to understand each other a little more and trying to understand what people are doing in the field of restoration, of eco-restoration, maybe there's some synergy that's possible. But I also want to say that, it's very, very young days for restoration practice in this country. We're a very small tribe of people. I think we'd be very hard very hard to put together 2 cricket teams of restoration experts in this country. We've got a small sampling of 6 people, 6 very interesting people, and 6 people who bring different experiences, different kinds of learning, and people who are working in different parts of the country. So I'm hoping that, put together, you will get a wonderful sense of what it's like to be working, say, in the Northeast, in the rainforest, or working in the desert, which is what I'm going to be talking about, or working in the montane grasslands of the Nilgiris, which is what Vasant will talk about, or the rewilding of industrial sites, which is what Paul Blanchflower is going to talk about, or Supi Session's wonderful session, which is going to be on the highlands of Wayanad. So it's going to be a wonderful session. I'm really looking forward to it. Recently, I wrote an article about Delhi's central ridge. And one of the things I said about the ridge was that, in a sense, what lies here is a great potential project to make the ridge into one of the most beautifully restored habitats spread over 8 square kilometers in the heart of a huge metropolitan city. But I said, we probably don't have the right people yet to do it. It needs a coalition of designers and sign writers and restoration experts and foresters all working together. And I said that maybe 20 years down the line, we'll find the right people. What's disturbing to me is that the Delhi government has recently announced last week that, yes, we're going to go ahead and we're going to restore it, they say. And almost every single aspect of what they're talking about makes my hackles rise, because they're going about it the wrong way, which is why I come back to this point that we really need to hold hands with landscape architects for this kind of thing. Lastly, can I just welcome Divya Mudappa and Shankar Raman, whose work I've admired for a long time. I'm going to hold up 2 wonderful books. This is the book that Shankar wrote. Was it last year, Shankar, or the year before that? But wonderful collection of little stories about rewilding work that's happening in different parts of India. And then this beautiful book, The Pillars of Life, with gorgeous illustrations by somebody who is relatively unknown in the field of botanical illustration, about the trees of some of the rare trees in the Western Ghats. Really looking forward to your talk, Divya and Shankar. I'm going to leave it to you to introduce yourselves and to talk a little bit about your journey before you get into your talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pradeep.
Thank you so much. We will just share our screen now.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Divya. And thanks, Pradeep and ISOLA, for organizing this series of talks. And it's a great pleasure for us because it is also a very new audience. We've largely been in a bubble of other ecologists or a few restoration practitioners, like Pradeep was mentioning. So it is, we are really looking forward to this interaction after the talk. So this is the landscape we live in. It is in the Anamala Hills of the Western Ghats, which is south of the Palghat Gap. And it's obviously named after the elephants. However, the way we started this work, I'd like to give you a brief introduction as to how we got into restoration. I started off as an ecologist many decades ago, studying Malabar grey hornbills and great hornbills, and also started studying the brown palm civet, which is a nocturnal carnivorous mammal. I mean, it's a carnivore, it's not carnivorous. I was pleasantly surprised to find that they're fruit eaters. And all these 3 species that have been studying are fruit eaters and very key seed dispersers in the forest that I work in. And I realized that while studying these animals, I also needed to learn a lot about plants because they were so dependent on plants. And the forests that they were living in were also in turn dependent on them. The quality of the forest depended on the abundance of these animals that I was studying. And just like you people, I realized that they are the landscape architects of the forests that I work in. Here is a short video where you will see what the landscape looks like and a few frugivores. And most importantly, the hornbills, which carry fruits and seeds far and wide and help regenerate the forests. Here you see them feeding on figs. And figs are a very important keystone species in almost all ecosystems that we have.
just as Divya was doing her work as an ecologist, I was also training to become an ecologist. But my focus was on doing research on birds. I started by studying birds in rainforests, in areas that were relatively undisturbed rainforests. But I also looked at what happens when these rainforests are either broken up into bits or patches, what we call rainforest fragments, or they are outright converted into other kinds of habitats. You know, plantations such as tea plantations, coffee plantations, cardamom, eucalyptus, teak, and so on. There are birds that somehow manage to survive in these sort of human altered or modified landscapes, but there are others which are found only in the forests, including some of the endemic species found only in the Western Ghats and not found anywhere else. So a lot of my research started by just looking at birds, and through the birds learning about different aspects of the landscape and what makes one species survive in one kind of habitat and not found in another area. We began our research in a landscape that looked like this. This is our research station in the middle of Kalakkad-Mundandurai Tiger Reserve. There are very few places like this left in the Western Ghats where you have large tracts of forest, contiguous forest with very little human presence, and immersed in this landscape for nearly 3 years, completely or relatively cut off from the rest of the world, no internet, no electricity. We were able to begin to appreciate what a remarkable ecosystem it is. The kind of diversity, the kind of complexity, and the intricate relationships between plants and animals, between the birds and the trees that they are attached with. This sort of understanding is what we were beginning to gain as ecologists while working in this landscape. But in more recent years, we moved to a very different landscape where we have been doing much of our work. And that is the landscape of the Anamalai Hills. Now, in the Anamalai Hills of the Western Ghats, particularly the region where we work is the Valparai Plateau. And it's a sort of emblematic of many other parts of the Western Ghats. Earlier, you had large tracts of forest, but much of this historically has been converted to other kinds of land use. In this case, you see here that there is a large area of tea plantations, which is abutting the Anamalai Tiger Reserve, where you have some forest left. But even in the middle of these tea plantations, where there are roads and people and settlements, you also have patches of forest, what we call the rainforest fragments, which are very important habitats. So this is the area where we have been doing a lot of work over the many years. And just to give you a picture of this and a bird's eye view of the landscape, you can take a look here. The Anamalai is an amazing place. It has some really wonderful forests that are filled with wildlife. But we came here for another reason. The Valparai Plateau is one of the most unique landscapes I have ever seen. It is a mix of tea and coffee estates with patches of rainforest in between. This place has a history. More than 100 years ago, all this was rainforest. But now, the forests look like islands floating in an ocean of tea. For us as ecologists, the challenge was to understand what happens in a landscape that has been so transformed by human action historically. So today in this landscape, a lot of our work focuses on the patches of forest that are left here. So what we call rainforest fragments, which you can see in this picture as well. These rainforest fragments do not sort of live in isolation. They are abutting other kinds of landscape elements. There are settlements, there are plantations of tea and eucalyptus and coffee, and there are some areas which are degraded. So a lot of our work has tried to understand how plants and animals are affected by this kind of change in the landscape and what we can do to conserve what remains. And over the years, this is work that has been done by a large team of people. Divya and I work with this organization called the Nature Conservation Foundation. So a number of our students and colleagues and others have come and done research in this landscape to understand the consequences of habitat fragmentation and the sorts of changes that we have seen here. Besides us, there have also been people from other institutions, and that knowledge has built up over time. So we've done research on the plants that are found in these patches of forest and in the surrounding landscape. We have looked at species like the primates. You have a photo here on the top right of the lion-tailed macaque, which is an endemic primate found only in the rainforests of the Western Ghats. In the Anomalais, nearly 25% of the population of the species is found in these kinds of patches of forest which are lying in private lands. But besides that, we have looked at bats, we've looked at birds, we've looked at reptiles and frogs. We've studied how elephants move through the landscape. We've also studied other groups such as the otters that use the streams that pass through the forests and the plantations in this landscape. And this is obviously not work that we've done alone. As I mentioned, it was done along with Nature Conservation Foundation and many of our colleagues who are based out of our research station in the Anomalai Hills. You can see here a photograph of our team in the Anomalai Hills. They're sitting in our rainforest plant nursery, which is like a center point of much of our work in this landscape. So given that all that we learned in our research as ecologists, we found that these patches of forest that remain in the, even though it is a fragmented landscape and it has been heavily modified by humans, there is a lot of value in continuing to protect them. And in fact, in areas that are degraded, we wanted to see if there are opportunities to restore them, to make them better, or to bring them back to what they were at some time in the past. Now, this is something that ecologists call ecological restoration. It has been defined as the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. It's something that requires a lot of attention as well as human inputs to achieve that. And in this landscape, our goal for restoration was to bring back the rainforest in order to conserve the biological diversity of the Anomalai Hills. As you are perhaps aware, the Anomalai Hills in the Western Ghats are a very special region with a lot of species which are found nowhere else in the world. And it was driven by a motivation to protect what remains and to try and improve the situation that that we started our ecological restoration project. So how do we go about it? Now, just to go back to the landscape, here is a photograph. Here's a Google Earth image of the landscape that we work in. You can see the Anomalai Tiger Reserve forests to the north and to the east. And in the landscape of tea plantations, we have marked out many of the forest patches that remain in yellow, what you see in yellow. These are the forest fragments that remain in the landscape. And if we were to sort of think in an ideal world, what we would like to do in restoration, one of the things that we would have liked to do is something like this. Can we increase the area of forest and also try and connect these bits of patches together and connect them to the larger tracts of forest that remain within the Anomalai Tiger Reserve? This will have the benefit of increasing the area under forest, as well as enabling a lot of species that continue to use this landscape to find corridors of movement such that they can move through this, and they are also connected to the larger populations that you could find in the surrounding landscape. But as you can see from this, this would involve working with the people who own the land. There are many tea and coffee plantations and other estates through which this sort of thing would pass. So as a first step, we would have to work to get these local partners on board. So starting way back in 2000, we began a dialogue with many of the plantation companies here. And over many months, in fact, it took nearly 2 years for us of dialogue to get some of them interested and to understand what we were trying to do here. But fortunately, many of them were very positive for this, and they came forward to partner with us in trying to do restoration in this landscape. So besides the plantation companies, the tea and coffee plantation companies, we had to work with the forest department and get them on board. We had to also work with local people to understand their needs and also tap into their knowledge of the landscape, and as we went about doing this work. But what results from this engagement with local people is that you are often have to compromise on what areas you can actually restore. So instead of the areas that we imagined, we ended up with getting different patches of forest in different fragments distributed across the landscape, where we were able to begin the restoration work. So companies like Tata Coffee and Pari Agro came on board, and Tea Estates India Limited, and they said, yes, let's start with these patches. So those patches were the areas that we decided that we can start our restoration work. But if we were to do ecological restoration, which, as we mentioned, is the idea is to try and bring back what was lost earlier, how do you go about it? What are the steps that one would need to take to achieve that? The first thing we needed to understand is to sort of have a target or a benchmark. How do these sites look like today, and what would they have looked like in the past before they were broken up into fragments or degraded? And to understand that, we had to go back into some of the best rainforests that remain and to understand what the differences are. You can see that in this short video.
The rainforest also has multiple layers in its structure. The forest floor is humid and moist and covered in leaf litter. It is under these conditions that the rainforest seeds germinate. The shrub layer above the forest floor forms the mid-story. It is composed of woody plants that provide spaces for animals that live near the forest floor. Above this is the canopy that forms the cover and has its own unique set of plants and animals. The arboreal diversity of a rainforest is dependent on this layer. The multi-tiered structure of a rainforest is very important. If this is affected, the diversity also gets affected. Our field research showed that even though there were shrubs and trees growing inside fragments, they lack the structural complexity and diversity of a rainforest.
So we got a sense of how the forest fragments were different from these undisturbed forests. As Divya just mentioned, the forest fragments tend to be much more degraded. They have more weeds, the canopy is more open, and we have some idea of what we would need to do to bring back the original rainforests. But bringing back rainforests also involves identifying what would be the appropriate species to bring back to those sites. Now, this is a very crucial question in all restoration projects, and it's a very important aspect that we use the right species which are suitable for that particular ecosystem and that particular locality. And there are different ways you can go about to identify what these right species are. The first source that you could look at are historical sources. There may have been books such as the floras. So in 1920s, in the Annamalai Hills, Fisher brought out a flora of the Annamalai Hills, which described the species found there and which ones are native and which are the ones that were planted by the Britishers who came in that period. There may be forest department working plans of olden days. So all this information helps to identify what would be the right native species for a given area. Another source of information are the indigenous people who live in the landscape. In the Annamalais, we were very fortunate to work with a large number of the Kadar people who have intimate knowledge of the forests. And in fact, almost all our work is done alongside them. And we have learned about the forests, the landscape, the species, and through interactions with them. So tapping into that knowledge is another second way to know what would be the appropriate species for a particular ecosystem. The third source is to go and find what we call a benchmark site. It's a sort of a reference site, areas that are relatively undisturbed and have good patches of forest still remaining. So you can go into those areas in the same landscape and study it to understand what are the species found here. Historically, they are likely to have occurred in neighboring sites, and through that research, you can sort of understand what the right native species are. So these are multiple ways in which we could arrive at what is the set of species that we should be looking at for restoration. But it's not just having a big list of species. You need to know which species goes where, because each species has its own ecological niche and has its own requirements. So one aspect to consider in a mountainous landscape like the Western Ghats is altitude. So the Annamalai Hills, for instance, has forests all the way down from lower elevations near 300, 400 meters to the highest peaks, which are about 2,600 meters. So you go from low elevation rainforests to what is called the unique shola and grassland ecosystems at the higher levels. Now, the Valparai Plateau, where we work, is largely in the mid-elevation rainforest zone. And that zone has its own set of species. So here, for instance, we've given a sort of a schematic graph which shows a selection of the diversity of species that you find in mid-elevation rainforests. And each of the concentric circles tells you a little bit about the species. So for instance, the yellow circle shows species that grow in more moderate to high shade environments. The blue circle indicates species that are found in open areas. The orange indicates those that grow along streams and swamps. And the final circle, the green one, indicates species that are very slow growing and some which are fast growing. So if you take a species such as the one at the bottom of the screen called Holigana nigra, it's found, it grows only in dense shade and it grows very slowly. At the other end, at the top of this screen, you have a species like Vernonia, which can grow in open, it can grow in dense conditions, it can grow along streams, and it grows pretty fast. So understanding these nuances and the differences among species is another important aspect to know what species goes where when you are actually carrying out the planting. But it's important to also know that you don't just choose one species out of this, right? You have the set of species, you have some knowledge of which species should go where. You also need to work on identifying what would be an appropriate protocol when you actually go about restoration. So in tropical forests, people have used different sort of three main protocols when they plan a restoration project. One is an approach where you go and use a set of a few species which are pioneers. Pioneers are species that grow in open conditions. They establish in a degraded area, they grow very fast. Like this photo shows a macaranga tree, which grows really fast and provides some shade. And as the tree establishes, it allows other species to come up under it. So planting a few pioneers or nurse species can sometimes be used to kickstart a restoration program. Another approach is to use what we call the framework species approach. Now, framework species are plant species that grow fast, but they are also very important in that they produce fruits that attract a lot of the native animals and birds, like Divya described about the hornbills and civets. So when these trees grow and they start producing fruits, they attract birds like this Malabar barbet you see in this picture. And when they come, they also bring seeds of other species and they help kickstart the process of forest regeneration. So that's the framework species approach. But in forests like in the Western Ghats, particularly the rainforests, which are extremely diverse and which are very complex, the most appropriate approach is probably what is called the maximum diversity approach, where you try and bring back as many of the species as possible. There is no point in trying to bring a few species to an area where if the original ecosystem is something that would have had 80 to 100 plant species in a single hectare. So a maximum diversity approach is the approach that we chose because the goal of our restoration program was on conserving the biological diversity of the Annamalai Hills. And for that, this approach seemed like the best approach to take. So having the list of species and figuring out the approach is one aspect, but we also needed to raise those plants. And fortunately for that, we were given space by one of the plantation companies. Currently, Tata Coffee has provided space where we have a rainforest plant nursery. And we have spent a lot of effort in trying to raise a diversity of species here, taking care that we do not disturb the forests in the process. So almost all our plants are grown from seeds, and these seeds are not collected from the interior of forest. We don't go and dig the seedlings out of forests, or we don't go and collect large numbers of seeds from inside forests. Instead, we walk along trails, we walk along roads that pass through the forest, and we collect the seeds that fall on the road because they have very little chance of growing. And we carefully do this throughout the year and bring those to the nursery in order to grow them. You can see how that happens in a short video here. Some of the very knowledgeable and dedicated plant handlers were from the local communities. Their insights and constant care helped build a large enough collection of saplings for us to plant or distribute locally. With over 150 native species, the nursery became a precious repository of starting material for future rainforests. That just gave you a snippet of our nursery and how we went about raising a large diversity of species for use in restoration program. But we still needed a lot of work to do before we could take these into the ground. The first step was to ensure that the areas where we are going to do restoration are protected. There is no point trying to restore an area if it is, if it has no protection, and if what led to the degradation in the first place sort of continues again. So this again involved working with local stakeholders, the plantation companies. We mapped out all these patches of forest. The estates put it on their own maps as well, and we also marked it out on the ground through boards such as this. We held little meetings with the managers and the local people saying these patches of forest need to be protected, and we are planning to do some work here. So it was after this that we could then go on to the next stage. Now, within these patches of forest that were protected, we identified the most degraded areas for restoration. And when I say most degraded, one of the signs of degradation is the presence of weeds or invasive species. In this photograph, for instance, you see them clearing one of the major weeds that we are dealing with, which is Lantana camara, a weed that has come from Central America and has swept through large areas in India. Besides Lantana camara, we have to deal with other species such as the Chromalina odorata, which is the Siam weed. And we also have this little yellow flower, which you see at the bottom right corner, which is called Vedelia or Sphagmaticola trilobata. It is very often used in landscaping as ground cover, and it spreads rapidly into the forests. So these weeds suppress the forest regeneration, and we have to very carefully remove them. You can see in the photograph that while the weeds are being cut, any native plants that remain as part of the mix are not cut. They're very carefully left. And this is a very important part of our restoration strategy, because these plants grow really fast after they are freed up from weeds, and they enable the other plants that we plant to establish as well. So after the plots are established, we wait for the monsoons. Usually between May and July of every year, when the southwest monsoon comes, we go into these sites, and the plants that have been raised in the nursery are planted out, as you can see here. So over the years, our restoration effort has worked in a number of fragments. The companies that we work with have protected nearly 35 fragments, occupying about 1,075 hectares. We raised about 160 species in our nursery, and we went and planted them in 17 of the more degraded sites. Each year, planting a small area. Rarely do we plant more than 5 hectares in a year. And over the years, over the last 2 decades, this has meant that we have planted about 100,000 saplings in an area of about 80 hectares, trying to bring back rainforest into these. So the protocol we have used right through is one of weed removal, followed by a mixed native species planting using a very high or a maximum diversity approach. Now, how has this restoration worked? Over the last few years, we sort of sat back and said, okay, we've done all this. Now we need to go back and see how has it worked, or has it worked at all? How do you assess whether your restoration efforts have been successful or not? One of the simplest ways to do this is through monitoring with photographs. So here is, for example, one of our smallest restoration sites, a 1 hectare patch of rainforest, which is next to a highway. You can see the site as it was on the left in 2005, where the weeds have been removed. It's very sparse and open, and hardly any trees are there, and what the site looks like today. A couple of other examples. Here is a site that was being grazed by cattle. It was more like an open meadow in 2002 when we planted here, and we had to actually fence the area and plant here just to provide temporary protection from grazing. And you can see in 4 years, this is what the site looked like, and this is what the site looks like today. These trees are now nearly 15 meters tall. Some of them have started flowering and fruiting. They are attracting birds, and the seeds are falling to the ground, and process of regeneration are starting. So it's like a mini forest right now. Here's another example of a restoration site where we tried to involve the plantation managers and local school children. We brought them to the site, and they actually carried out the planting in the site. You can see the site in the background, very open. After the weeds removed, just a smattering of shrubs. And this is what the site looks like today. The trees are large enough that in the last couple of years, a troop of Nilgiri langurs, which is a primate, a monkey species found only in the Western Ghats. This troop of langurs have come and they have started living in this patch of forest, and we see them now regularly when we go there. While photographs are a simple and obvious way to monitor these changes, you can also use other tools. In this, for instance, we show one of our restoration sites using Google Earth. The upper photo shows you how the site looked like. You can see that there are a few trees, but most of the area looks sparse with shrubs, and there are even patches which look more or less open. And in the lower photo, which is just 10 years later, you can see that much of that area is closed with a tree canopy, and the canopy cover has increased. So it's beginning to look more like the sites that we are relatively undisturbed and which we targeted as our benchmarks. Besides Google Earth, you can use other tools. Recent tools are the one called Collect Earth, which enables you to actually monitor these sites, track changes in forest cover, and it integrates with other tools such as Earth Engine. There's also a tool called Restore, which is coming out.
Actually, nicely, please join.
And you can just explore the links given here to learn more about them. So these are photographs, and these kind of imagery-based tools are one. But you can also go directly into these sites to learn a little more. For instance, if you want to know exactly how the plant community has changed, it would require fieldwork on the ground. So what we did is that we went to these benchmark sites, which is relatively undisturbed areas that you find in the Annamalai Tiger Reserve. We went into the restoration areas where we had actually carried out the restoration. And we also identified adjoining areas that were unrestored. They were just left as it is for natural regeneration. And we put plots in them. We, 20 by 20 meter plots, and we would measure the trees. We see how many trees are there, how tall they are, how much canopy there is. And there are ways to measure their carbon and so on. So by making this comparison, we wanted to see, are the restored sites better than just sites left to their own devices? And have they improved? And if they have they improved in the direction of the benchmark, which is sort of our goal and the way in which you assess whether a restoration project is working or not. So just to provide you some results, this graph is showing you 3 such variables that we looked at. One is the density of trees. The second panel shows you the number of species per unit area. And the third one shows how much carbon there is stored per hectare in these sites. The orange shows the sites where nothing was done. They were just left alone. They were just protected. So that's just natural regeneration occurring. The light green shows the sites where we did this intensive restoration work. And the benchmark sites are our target, where we hope to be eventually. And you can see that even after nearly 2 decades of work, that there is only partial recovery. The restored sites are better than the unrestored, but they are sort of only halfway there. If you look at, for instance, the carbon stocks, there's about 70 tons of carbon per hectare in the unrestored areas, and that's increased to about 150 on average in the restored sites. But look at where the rainforests benchmarks are. They are close to 300 tons per hectare. So it's a remarkable ecosystem. And even after this amount of effort, we are only part way there. Besides looking at the plants, we also tried to see whether the animals are coming back. We had some signs, like we started seeing the Nilgiri langurs coming to that patch of forest, but we also did some formal research to see whether the birds are recovering with restoration. So once again, we went into these benchmark sites, the restored sites and the unrestored sites, and we carried out counts of birds, repeatedly visiting these sites over an entire season and documenting it. And we found a very similar pattern. The number of rainforest species was best in the benchmark sites, but the restored sites had improved somewhat in relation to sites where nothing was done.
So Shankar has given you an overview of how we went about restoring patches of forest in the Annamalais over a 20-year period. And what I think one of the main things we learned from this effort is that we cannot bring back what is once lost. So even after 20 years of work and very concerted work, there's been only partial recovery in most of the aspects of a rainforest. So, I think one of the golden rules of reforestation is let us protect what is left. In this case, rainforest, but I think we are talking about any other ecosystem because each of these ecosystems is unique. So what are the challenges? Why hasn't it recovered? So for one, we were mainly working on trees. So while the trees grew, it is not necessary that all the plants started regenerating on their own. There were many different groups of plants, especially the herbaceous and the shrub plants, which would not come there on their own. So we have not attempted to bring back, like I was explaining earlier, that there are many tiers in a rainforest, and we worked only in the canopy stature. And but despite using a maximum diversity protocol, we still have not recovered the diversity that has been lost due to degradation. Similarly, there are many aspects which have not recovered as much as we had expected. We are not even sure that they will recover and over what period of time, if at all they do recover. But in addition to this, every seasonally we have a lot of other challenges, which includes fire set by people. Sometimes we do not know the origin of the fire, so they have swept through some of our restoration sites. We've had to give up many of the restoration sites due to fire. And these fires are, of course, worse where there is a lot of weed invasion, particularly lantana. We also have, like we were saying, what is the cause of degradation? It could be local people being dependent on these forest patches. And so regularly there are trees that we have planted. Once they are pole size, they are being harvested or cut. And we have had no means to address this issue because it involves a lot of change locally, and also the state authorities trying to find alternatives for this for the people who are dependent on these forests. Despite all these challenges, we've managed to recover some amount of diversity and stand capacity of these forest fragments. And those of you who heard Pradeep, there are global initiatives by the UN, which has declared this as a decade of ecosystem restoration. And there is Bond Challenge, to which India is a signatory and has set a goal of restoring 30 million hectares within the end of this decade. These are good good steps that are being taken globally and are necessary at this point. However, like Pradeep was mentioning, it is quite scary because we do not know where these plants are going to be planted. It is very likely that the restoration is seen as planting trees, and it is not necessary that planting trees is restoration. We need to identify the ecosystems that we need to restore. Each of these ecosystems have a very crucial role to play because they have evolved over millions of years. And we are very worried that most of these restoration efforts will happen in what is designated as wastelands, which usually happen to be grasslands or open areas. And as an ecologist, there are no wastelands. These are ecosystems with their own unique set of species, both animals and plants. And so unless the authorities or the government takes cognizance of this and actually partners with experts who understand these systems, we are really worried that these challenges or these targets are going to cause more harm than good to whatever little of the natural ecosystems that we have left. The second thing that really worries us is the compensatory afforestation program by the government. Very often, and I'm sure most of you are aware, there are natural ecosystems that are being that were once protected or even not protected, but are being denotified or designated for infrastructure projects, development of industries, etc. And these are very intricate, very unique ecosystems. And once they are lost, they are, compensatory afforestation basically supports growing trees somewhere else. And most often the trees that are grown are non-native species. They are monocultures, which is single species plantations. At best, like I've indicated, more than 50% of the area that has been planted have less than 5 tree species, and most often they are not native species. This can have very, very detrimental effect on natural ecosystems. And you may also have seen reports where we are all the time saying forest cover has grown and we should be happy about it and we have reached our targets. But this is just to bring to your attention, if you see the panel on the right, these are satellite images or aerial images of forests. And to an untrained eye, most of them, they all look more or less similar. So, oh, wow, there's a green cover. But if you actually go on the ground and go into these forests, you will see that while one could be a good, a diverse rainforest, the other could be completely degraded. And sometimes even plantations look like a very good stand of natural forests. So this is something that we really need to keep in mind every time we claim that there has been expansion of forest areas, forest cover, green cover, and we really need to question this and also understand at what cost these targets are being met. So final 2 slides. One is that what we want to reiterate is that ecosystem restoration is not always tree planting. And in our case, where we work in diverse ecosystems with trees, compensatory afforestation or any other sort of targets are met by planting a single species monoculture, which leads to biodiversity loss. And most often these single species plantations have much poorer carbon storage capacity. And even in degraded forest, if you plant them with the wrong species, we are going to further lose the diversity that we are trying to currently conserve. Many of you might be aware of the species loss that is going on globally, and we are experiencing a 6th extinction, a mass extinction period right now. So alien invasive species or alien species are not going to help us conserve our biodiversity. So finally, to end, a few take-home points, particularly to the landscape architects, because I think most of you will be working in areas which are close to either natural areas or sometimes even within urban areas or suburbs, where I think we have India has an amazing countryside, and we have very many diverse ecosystems. So wherever you're working, it would be really great if you could identify what the natural ecosystem is, whether it's grasslands or forest. You learn, like Shankar was mentioning, from available material, local people, partner with stakeholders, including state authorities, plan in the long term, and engage with the landscape over a long term in order to achieve your goals. And these goals set to natural benchmark sites or reference sites. And every ecosystem, I think what we need to aim is to maximize biodiversity conservation by using appropriate species and appropriate native species. However, it is also a challenge for the availability of native species in most regions. And it is not easy, but we need to plan to have these sources. And these sources should not be obtained from natural ecosystems by damaging these natural ecosystems. Like Shankar was once again mentioning, when we are collecting seeds or plant material or plant sources, we should not, we should collect very ethically and sustainably and not damage whatever little is left in the places that we are working in. And of course, one of the main things is maximize diversity. Do not go for monocultures. Do not plant non-native species as far as possible, and definitely do not plant invasive species. One of the examples Shankar gave was Vedalia, which is very often used to establish ground cover to prevent soil erosion. They are very pretty, they look very beautiful with yellow flowers, etc. And they grow very fast. However, the impact they have on natural ecosystems or in a landscape is quite irreversible. So with this, we'd like to end our talk. We'll be happy to take questions. Once again, thank you so much, ISOLA and Pradeep, for giving us this opportunity to share our experience. Over the last 20 years, we've been supported by many funding agencies and partners. Currently, we are supported by Rohini Nilekani Philanthropies, Murugappa Chettiar Research Center, and Franklinia Foundation. We also have local partners with Tata Coffee Limited and Pariagro and Goodbaraya Group. And Tamil Nadu Forest Department has been very supportive of our work in the plantations. And we have many collaborators in other institutions. Lots of the pictures that we have used are thanks to our friends and collaborators and photographers and people who have been working with us over many years. This is one of our sites where we've planted recently. On the right, you do see some canopy cover, but most of that, as you may recognize, is Glidicidia, which is a non-native species. On the left, it is completely open. So this is a challenge that we've just started in 2019. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. I'll just stop sharing this.
Yeah, thank you, Divya and Shankar. I think we open up for the question and answer session. Would request, as Aditya mentioned earlier, you can type in your name and question, and then we'll ask you to unmute and ask the questions by yourself. In the chat box, if you have any questions, you can type in your questions.
Just to get the ball rolling, can I start by asking a question?
Sure.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
You know, we have an agency called the Forest Department, which is, brilliantly poised to do great work in this country, but abysmally equipped to do it in terms of their training, in terms of their outlook, in terms of the history of the Forest Department and their attitude. It's interesting to see that you've partnered with them. I'm just wondering whether you had any success at all in influencing them, changing their attitudes, helping them to realize, some of the insights that you bring to this work.
Yeah. It's been a difficult it's been difficult to do that because they have their own systems and there's a lot of systemic inertia involved there. But we've had some partial success. So in one case where we worked with them to try and remove an invasive species, that is wattle, that was encroaching into grasslands at the higher elevations. So it took some dialogue, and we were able to persuade them that this is a species that is invading into a natural ecosystem. And in fact, they came on board, and along with the forest department, we managed to actually reduce wattle invasion in a significant area thanks to that. As far as the rainforest restoration work goes, it's been more of a challenge, particularly in relation to getting them to raise the species and to find a
Did that
thank
answer
you.
your question?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Karthik Gokhale, do you want to ask your question?
Yes. Hello, sir. Hello, ma'am. I am a student of forestry from Uttarakhand. I wanted to ask how did you select the appropriate proportion for the species composition? I mean, like how many fruiting plants or how many different shrubs or trees should be planted in order to maintain the balance?
So we did not try and replicate the exact proportions as you see in benchmark sites because it's extremely difficult to do. Our idea was to bring back a large diversity of species to these sites. And when you're planting such a large diversity of species, you'll find that some of them are growing fast, some of them are growing slow. And over the years, some die and, natural regeneration is also kicking in. So the composition of the forest will change over time. It is not that if I plant 30% of species A, 20% of species B, and so on, that the same proportion will be carried over time. So that's very, very difficult to do, and no one can do that. And we also know that, like Divya mentioned, the primary forest, as far as possible, we should protect existing patches of forest, good patches of forest. If they are degraded, we can try and improve the condition, but we are very, very unlikely to get the original, exact, mature forests back. All we are trying to do is to make it better than it would otherwise be. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I further wanted to ask if you noticed any proportion during your research in the original forest patches. Did you find the proportion of what different species were there, and what were more and what were less, and how did it affect the ecosystem?
To some extent, yes. So we have done work to understand not just the diversity, but like you're saying, what are the proportion of different groups? What are the common ones? Which are the rarer species? We can also look at it in terms of the different functional groups of plants. For instance, you can look at species that are mature forest species that tend to grow in shade versus those which are more open or secondary successional or secondary forest species. So we looked at those proportions. We also look particularly at the proportions of trees that have large seeds, because these are often affected by habitat fragmentation. It's very difficult for a tree which has large seeds for the seed to move large distances, particularly if species like hornbills are not there in the landscape. And so their populations tend to decline in fragments. So our studies looked into these aspects, but we found that as far as possible, using a high diversity approach does work in terms of bringing back partial recovery, and it brings, for instance, the proportion of mature forest species is increasing in the direction towards the benchmark. So most of those trends are in the right direction, although we haven't got to the benchmark yet.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Okay, I guess the next question is from Daivat, and he's interested to interested in knowing the ethics of ecological restoration. If you can talk about it, I guess partly it was answered when you answered Mr. Pradeep's query, but if you would want to add to it.
It's a very interesting question. And definitely it's something to think about. There are many aspects to consider. So for instance, when you're doing restoration, often you're also removing weeds. You're cutting habitat, and when you're cutting the shrubs like lantana and so on, they also may have some species that are using them. So it's important to be cognizant of that. So when we do our weed removal, we are still careful, although it's a weed, if there's a bird's nest in it, or if there's a wasp nest in it, and so on, we take care not to disturb it. So to do almost all aspects of restoration, there are ethical considerations involved, and we have to keep it in mind,
including people's dependence on these forests. So in our case, since they are on private land, which belongs to private landowners, it is not so much used by local communities, other than some people depending on it for fuel wood, not so much for other purposes. Therefore, depending on where you're working, you might have to plan your project based on the needs of the people, local indigenous people as well, and access for it. So it is something, in many sites, one need to consider it.
Yeah. Also, if you look at the literature, people have written about the ethics of going a little overboard about this difference between an alien species and a native species. It's important that you don't use alien species, particularly when they are invasive, into an ecosystem, but you don't want to become sort of xenophobic about it or too this thing about it. In other contexts, that species could play an important role, or in other parts of the landscape. So for instance, in the Annamalai Hills, we have eucalyptus plantations, which are periodically harvested and used as fuel for the tea factories. It makes sense for us that the eucalyptus is used as fuel rather than them cutting natural forests or importing coal from some faraway mining site. So it's not that we are blindly opposed to eucalyptus just because it's an alien species. And so those are some other aspects, the ecological aspects as well as certain ethical aspects to consider. And seed collection is another aspect that we mentioned. People, in order to set up a nursery, if you have a target and you don't have the time, people go and collect hundreds or thousands of seedlings from forests, or go deep into forests and gather lots of seeds. That can also affect the forest, and you don't want to do that as part of a restoration program.
Anything you would want to ask more, Daivat, on this, or it answers your query?
Hi, yeah, it answered my query. Thank you so much.
Is there any other question?
I think so.
Okay, I'm going to ask you another question just to fill in the silence. Am I right in understanding that when you started this work, you were not in any sense botanically trained, right? You were wildlife scientists, you were basically ornithologists, right? I wonder whether you want to just describe the process by which you learned about plants, because for a lot of landscape architects as well, this is a journey that they will need to undertake beyond the training that they're given in landscape architecture school. So I just wondered whether you could share that process of learning about plants.
Yeah. So although we were not trained botanists and we wanted to study animals, when we were doing our masters, we did have botany as one of the subjects that we studied. But what you study in a classroom really does not match anything that you study out in the field. So once we went into the forest, and like I was mentioning during the introduction, when I landed up studying animals that ate so many fruits, and then I had to figure out what they were eating, because part of my study was to look at their diet and how the diet is available to them. And so that's how I landed up learning a lot about plants and learning to identify them, figuring out where they're growing and how they're distributed in the landscape.
Yeah, it's to a large extent it's about training yourself to notice. So for when I started work on birds, and when you're looking at forest birds, you have all sorts, right? You have some birds that like babblers and thrushes, which may largely be at the ground level, some in the shrubs and some up in the trees. And then you walk into a plantation, let's say eucalyptus or a teak plantation, you have the same thing, right? You have leaves, you have trees, you have canopy, but the birds are not there. Some of the birds that which I see in the rainforest are not here. Why is that so? To answer that question, I had to look a little more closely and see that the kinds of trees and the kinds of resources they provide are very different. And so to learn more about the diversity of plants was very key for me to understand what's happening to the birds. And in that process, we actually started off with, at that time, there weren't too many very good field guides to the trees of the Western Ghats, which is remarkable, plant diversity. Fortunately, the French Institute had one book where it helped us to learn to identify trees just by looking at the leaves, rather than, getting flowers and looking at the intricacies under a microscope. So using vegetative characters, we trained ourselves to learn, hey, this is a different tree, that's a different tree. And then when you walk into a forest, you start seeing it very, very differently. It's not just some green cover or some trees that are distributed, but an array of trees. And then when you go from one side to another, you begin to appreciate these differences more. You begin to understand why this area is cooler, has better canopy, why this area has hornbills and that one doesn't, and so on.
Yeah, and as we are going on with our restoration work, even after 20 years, we're learning something new all the time. Like what is we want to maximize diversity, but then not often do we get as many seeds as we'd like, or as many species as we would like. And with a few research studies and more recently using camera traps, etc., we figured why we don't get some of the seeds, because they are so eaten up by other seed predators, and they are a natural part of the system. And so like for example, there is a species called Kulenia, and it fruits copiously, and you do see a lot of seeds. And then if you put it off for a day, the collection of seeds even along roads, if you put it off by a day, you go back the next day and you don't see these seeds. And then we realized with a recent study that Nilgiri langurs even come on the ground to eat those seeds. There are porcupines which eat those seeds. So yeah, so there's a lot about the system that we learn as we collect seeds and try to grow them in our nursery as well.
Yeah, just wanted to add that for the landscape architects, it's also a lot of fun to once you start making the effort to learn plants, it becomes a bit of an obsession sometimes, and it's a lot of fun. And if you have looked at Pradeep's books, Trees of Delhi and Jungle Trees of Central India, and start using them, your life will change. You'll see landscapes differently, the places that you go to, you'll learn so much more about them if you learn to identify plants. It's definitely worth it.
Unfortunately, we don't have a book of this sort for the Western Ghats yet.
Yeah. Pradeep, you have to come and do it for us.
Can I request Tanay to ask his question? I guess it's dropped out. I can move to Kushal.
Hi, thank you, Aditya, Pradeep, ISOLA, and especially Divya and Shankar sir for this very informative presentation. I was wondering if, in addition to any of the other human factors, if you were able to recognize any natural conditions which have changed over time, which has led to this fragmentation and that is hindering the restoration to the, let's say, the expected percentages to the benchmark, It could be the water conditions have changed or dried up, or the soil has changed because of the tea and coffee plantations. You mentioned literally it's an ocean of tea and coffee in which these rainforest fragments are there. And a second kind of not associated question is, was there any element of public access designed? Because in some of our landscape design restoration projects, for example, to restore a wetland, we first try to make that wetland visible to a general audience so that people start caring about it and know that it exists. It was very essential that you showed those drone videos, both like within the forest and surrounding it also. So something like that really helps us to first know that a rainforest exists, and then also to start caring or start realizing what we are doing with it.
Yes, so good questions, and we have we've not monitored it in a very quantitative way, but at least qualitatively speaking, there are some natural factors that we feel are hindering the recovery. And I think the climate change that we have been seeing with very, very hot years, most of the hottest years of the last century have been in the last 2 decades. So that kind of climate change is definitely affecting the system. We are seeing areas that are, very dry. We're getting very hot summers, and sometimes you have a good bout of rain, but if you go there just a day later, you find that the soil is already parched and dry. And these are sort of things that we had not seen when we began even 20 years ago. The climate pattern is definitely changing, and it's hindering possibly the ability of these sites to recover. About the public access, the issue is that much of the work that we do is on private lands. So these are patches of forest that belong to private plantation companies. It's not within our means to just open it up for the public. And sometimes, particularly in a landscape where you have lots of tourists coming, the landowners may not want random tourists walking around in these areas. So the way we try to create awareness about restoration is different. We have a nature information center set up in Annamalai, in Valparai, and we conduct programs there. We bring people to the center. Sometimes we take them on field walks, guided walks in a few areas that are relatively more accessible, and talk to them about rainforests and about restoration. So we've tried to do that. We've also made a documentary. It's called A Dream of Trees. Circulated it widely. It's also available on YouTube if any of you are willing to are interested to watch. So through these sorts of measures, we've tried to create more public awareness, even if there isn't direct access to all the restoration sites.
Okay. Yeah, so we have an interesting question from Harshavardhan. If we have site where non-native species are planted, should we clear the site of those trees?
So it depends. It depends on where you are and what else is around you. So, and like for example, in the site where we work, we have actually planted rainforest species under eucalyptus, and they have grown very well. And not just under eucalyptus, there's also another invasive tree species called the Mesopsis, under which also we have planted native species, and they've come up well. And in fact, in our case, we feel that the shade and the leaf litter, etc., provided by these species have helped our plants as well. So it depends on what uses those sites and what plants they are, and how capable the land is of recovering, even with some additional planting, etc. So I would not say just go and remove it because it's a non-native species. I think you will have to first check what is coming up under it, and then decide what would be best to do.
I think one of the talks later on in this series will also talk about the Shola grassland landscape, where you have species such as wattle that have invaded into certain areas. And probably that speaker will give a better idea of this. There are some areas where it's better to maybe leave the native species and allow the other regeneration to come under it, Shola regeneration in this case, rather than remove it. So in some cases, we've seen people go with JCBs and try and remove large numbers of native species. And that often causes much more damage because you severely disturb the soil. It leads to invasion by other weeds. So this use of heavy machinery to take out a non-native species just because it's non-native is often can also be counterproductive. So it has to be carefully thought through, and it depends on the ecosystem and what your goals are.
Okay, thank you. I think Adit has a question related to this. When you do the new planting, any special work needed to prepare the soil before the planting?
We don't. In fact, other than using a handful of organic compost, we have not used any other fertilizers. But this year, in one of the sites where we had planted earlier and most of our plants did not do very well, this year we thought we would fertilize them with the NPK mixture. So otherwise, we do not use any other things. We do not prepare the soil. We only remove weeds, and we maintain these sites for about 2 years by constantly removing the weeds which are taking over the site. And once the canopy establishes, these weeds disappear, and these plants are really left to grow up on their own based on the climatic conditions, the rainfall, etc.
Yes, I had a question. Like, you look at this Miyawaki system the people follow, and they dig a big deep trench and they put a huge amount of fertilizer and straw in. And they plant a lot of trees, and the trees grow very fast. I was just wondering if the roots even go into the adjacent native soils, because there's such a rich soil mix to grow in. If that's a wonderful way to do it or not really, I want to hear your opinion about it.
I think it depends on where you're doing it. In natural ecosystems, where you have a lot of other things coming up on their own, I'm not sure clearing up an area and then giving so much of input is essential or necessary. However, in urban areas, or where you have to where you can potentially create a small patch of forest greenery, it might be okay. I must admit, I've not seen any of the sites where this work has been carried out, but I have read and heard that it is very successful. Once again, I think it depends on where it is done and where this method would be better than waiting for 20 years and waiting for the forest to grow on their own and animals to colonize this over a period of time.
But even if a Miyawaki method is used in some sites where it is appropriate, say even in a urban setting, or let's say even in Delhi, you're planning something that is close to the Delhi Ridge and you're carrying out this approach, some of the other principles of restoration would still apply. Are you using the right species? Are you sourcing the seeds correctly? Are you growing them locally rather than bringing plants from, let's say, somewhere in Uttar Pradesh or wherever the seed or seedlings available, just bring it on a truck and plant it. So those aspects should still be considered even if you're using a Miyawaki approach.
Once again, it's also about the cost. I think, yeah.
I was also curious, they tend to plant, I read somewhere like 9 trees in a square meter.
Yeah.
Is that like too many, or that seems like a lot of trees in a square meter? Huh?
Yeah, but what I've heard is that they actually, 9 species or 9 plants, but they are of different tiers. Like some of them are shrubs and some of them would be trees and some are larger.
Okay, it's not trees. Okay.
Then it should be all right, actually.
If the shrubs, right?
Yeah, this is correct. They are currently doing it partially successfully in Sanjay Gandhi National Park in Bombay, which is a kind of a setting between an urban interface with the forest. But it's exactly 9 trees in a square meter, and those are trees expecting that maybe 2 out of the 9 will actually survive. So survival for the fittest is the way that they're doing it, but in pretty small patches.
Yeah, once again, it would help to monitor some of these. And, for us, a lot of the learning in restoration has come by trial and error. It's not like we knew these answers beforehand, but as we did it, we sort of tried to keep monitoring it over time and learn from that. So if you're implementing this already somewhere, don't just believe that it's going to work. Keep tracking it, and if something is going wrong, it's not going in the direction you want it, you can do some course correction, and also make that information available to the wider community so that someone else somewhere doesn't repeat the same mistake.
Right. There's one question from Mayank. Mayank, if you would want to ask your own question, you can unmute and ask, please.
Thank you. Like you mentioned that you looked at the old literature and books and even the local communities and their traditional ecological like
Sorry, there's a lot of interference. Yeah.
Yeah. So I can read the question, Mayank. There's a lot of disturbance at your end. Yeah, as you mentioned that you looked at old literature or books and traditional ecological knowledge of the local communities for the reference sites. Did you find any difference in the baseline? That's what his question is, indicating a loss of ecological knowledge.
I would say partly. I think we used all those sources of information to understand what would be native species and what occurs in the rainforests of the Annamalai Hills. And the loss of ecological knowledge in the case of even among the tribal community, certainly there is. We've interacted with some of the elders as well as some of the younger people, and you can certainly see a difference. Although they definitely know a lot about the forest, some of the younger people do not know as much and as intimately the forest and the species as the elders in the community do. When you move out of the tribal into the others in the landscape, for instance, the people who work in the tea and coffee plantations and the managers, there is a tremendous loss of ecological knowledge. Many of them are people who have come from elsewhere to just work in the plantations, and very often they're not even aware of the species around them. What is which one is native, which one has been brought in. So yeah, that remains a challenge. A lot of our work is to create awareness in those stakeholder groups such that they keep learning more and beginning to appreciate the diversity of the rainforest there.
Thank you.
Okay, so so related to this, Seema Anthony is also interested to know to find out how the interaction with the local tribes in determining species and relating it to current information and scientific nomenclature is done.
Sorry, I didn't understand that question. Could you repeat?
I just read it. Seema, if you're around, if you can ask your own question.
Yeah, I was just interested to find out how you related what the communities knew and how you related to what the current information is available. Like in terms of the names of the trees, they probably knew it in their local language, but how do you relate it to what you are reading about these trees?
Actually, since a lot of young people from local indigenous communities work with us, it has been a learning process on both sides. They've learned some from us, particularly the current names of these species or English or scientific names of these species, and we have learned it from them. Not just the local names, but they have better knowledge of where something grows, what the use of that plant to their communities are, etc. So it has been a learning process on both sides.
Thank you. And I also
we mostly plant only trees and some woody lianas.
Okay.
Unfortunately, we have not managed or even tried to grow too many shrub species. A few, yes, but not too many, because we do not understand its ecology well enough.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Seema.
I have a question. Can I ask a question, please, Sheetal?
Yeah, please.
One of the most exciting books I've read recently is a book called Entangled Life by Merlin Sheldrake, which you've probably also seen. And it's phenomenal for awakening you to the importance of fungal net to to mycelium in the soil. And I'm wondering whether you have explored at all this business of why you get different results in different kinds of soils. Have you found any way at all of assessing the quality of soil and the presence or the different rates at which mycelium may or may not be present, or mycorrhizae may be present in the soil?
So although we studied about these things during our courses, we really did not go into it deeply. Sometimes we do regret it because some of the failures we've had, we believe could be because of this. We have carried out some very, very basic analysis of soil samples from different sites. But once again, we do not ourselves have the expertise to interpret the results we are seeing and how to address. I mean, you do see some vague patterns, but we do not really know how to address it. The third thing is that because we're working in areas which are very, very close to other sensitive natural ecosystems, we do not know how much our intervention in terms of introducing things should be when we ourselves do not know enough about it. So we have been on the more cautious side of intervention rather than experimentation and things like that. But I think there are a lot of people who are getting interested in this. They have started studying it in many other sites that we know of. And some of the students who worked with us have shown interest, and maybe in the future we will be doing something to make things better. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Should we move to Sanath Reddy for his question? Please ask your question, Sanath.
Yes. I've read the question. I could answer that.
Sure.
Everybody can see it. We do not specifically collect. We don't go looking out for civet droppings or any other droppings. But if we do see it on the road, we collect them. During my studies, where I was specifically experimenting with seeds collected from scats and those collected from under trees, there definitely was a higher germination from civet dropping. But we don't get so many seeds or so many species from civets alone. So we collect seeds from under trees along roads and trails. The other sources of seeds dispersed by plants have been from what we call hornbill middens. These are sites from under the hornbill nest, where there are a lot of seeds that fall, and we collect a part of it, not all of them, because we do want some of these hornbill food plants to regenerate close to the areas that we use. Anything else, Ron? I hope I've answered your question.
Yeah, I think there's some connection issue, but I think we'll move on to Somil's question. Somil, you want to ask your own question?
Yes. Hi, Divya and Shankar. Thank you for the great presentation. Firstly, before asking my question, I just wanted to tell everybody that I have seen a couple of Miyawaki forest sites in Delhi, and they look absolutely unlike any natural forest that exists in Delhi. And at least for the Delhi region, I think we should not even think about going for a Miyawaki kind of a system for restoration. What I wanted to ask was basically about what made you look at the landscape you were seeing for what it is, because I mean, of course, as trained ecologists, perhaps you are already trained to look at landscapes in a certain way. But generally, if people are working on a landscape, it's a natural thing to try and shape and scape the land. But what do you think can drive someone to look at things as they are before stepping in to do, change it? Or it's a
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. And sometimes we say that, and there's a very famous quote by Aldo Leopold, which says that one of the perils of an ecological education is that it opens your eyes to a world of wounds, and you start seeing the landscape very differently. I think for us, it came in multiple ways. So like Divya said, it started by looking at the fruits, and then you learn the trees, and then you start seeing how different sites are. For me, it came a lot by looking at the birds, and it's not just sight, it's also sound. I walk into a forest, and the bird calls I hear are very different from the bird calls I hear if I walk into, say, an oil palm plantation or something else. So that's also a part of the landscape. The soundscape, so to speak, is very, very different. And you're trying to grapple with why that is, and then you start seeing so many differences. So I think it comes through multiple ways, and it's also in when we are trying to create nature awareness in people. There are also programs which try to immerse you in the landscape and try to open up all your senses. So it's not just sight, it's sound, it's smell, it's texture. And I think if you look at Pradeep's book, for instance, on plants, you'll also see how many different textures there are to the bark of a tree, to the leaves, and so on. And all of this gives you a sense of how landscapes differ from each other. It's not just some green and some brown sort of indeterminate thing, but very, very, it sort of resolves before you into much more, and then you see the landscape differently. The risk of that is that once you understand, particularly how beautiful something is, or how diverse, or how rare something is, as ecologists, you often end up seeing it disappear before your eyes because of some force, and that can be heartbreaking as well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
One more thing is I realize that, for people who are involved in landscaping, I think there is a sense of aesthetic. And that sense of aesthetic is, the way I see it right now is very textbookish, as in a green lawn, a few palm trees, etc. But if you look at a ecosystem close to the area that you work in, it's probably, it will not look like that. So in that sense, I really like the work that Pradeep has done in Rajoda Park, where I think he's managed to combine both aesthetics as well as a natural, using a whole range of native species, but still that it looks very beautiful. And sometimes when we look at our restoration sites, we feel, we of course love them because it's a rainforest, but we always wonder, and a lot of other people who see these sites see it as a jungle, and it is very wild, and they don't find it beautiful. And I think that is one of the reasons why we brought out this book, Pillars of Life, where I think Deepani or somebody also had asked an earlier question. People want pretty trees and pretty flowers and something that is green all the time, etc. And that's the reason we got this book out, because we wanted the local people there to see that most of the trees that we have produce beautiful leaves and trees and flowers and things like that. But it is taking us a lot of effort to for people to appreciate what is local. I think people are still very caught up in finding something coming from somewhere else to be more valuable and beautiful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah. I would request Abhinaya to ask her question.
Thank you. Thank you for this very wonderful presentation. I would like to know about what kind of nurturing and care you need to do after the planting of saplings at the restoration site. For instance, of domestic animals, or like, do you need to water them? And for how long do you need to do this kind of care and nurturing for?
Yeah, it depends on the site. In some cases where we know that the site is close to an area where there is a risk of cattle grazing, you may need to do fencing to prevent the cattle grazing. Also work directly with the herders, identify them, talk to them, and tell them, something's happening here. Please don't bring your cattle in here. There are, and find out alternative sites for them where they could go, and so on. But most other kinds of interventions are very difficult for us because we work in rugged terrain, some remote sites, and it's also very expensive. So we have done limited fencing, and it's only temporary fencing. Once the plant's established, we remove the fence because ultimately we want it to look natural. We want animals to be able to move freely and so on. Watering of plants can be extremely helpful, at least in the first and sometimes the second summer. So we planted this year in the monsoon in say May, June. The highest mortality of plants is the following February, March, which is like the peak dry season. And plants that manage to survive the first dry season do better in the following year because they have tided over the first big crisis and they have established. So in that first season, if you could provide water, definitely it helps the plants and it helps establish them. But it's also can be difficult for our site, which is on top of a mountain, far away from a road. How do you get water there? To water all the plants that have been put can be a challenge. So we don't do that in most of our restoration sites. We try to plant very early in the monsoon such that the plants get at least 3-4 months of rain and they have time to establish as far as possible. The main work that happens, at least for the first 2 years, is beading. You have to keep going there and removing weeds for a period of time. And like Divya mentioned, once the plants grow to a certain height and they start providing shade and there is at least a low-level canopy, they shade out these weeds, after which you have very little work to do and you just sort of wait for the forest to grow up on its own.
Does that answer your query?
Yeah, yes, thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay. So I had a question. So the thing is, at times you may have found some remnant patches of forest or the forest patches where the trees have aged and at times they are like they would die eventually, but to bring them back to the cycle, how do you figure it out? And then do you recommend starting from seedlings, or you would sow some saplings, is what my question is.
We would, first of all, I mean, we don't see older trees or dying trees as a problem, really. Of course, if it's drying or dying because of some human intervention or because of climate change, it is a concern. But even dead trees are a very important part of a restoration site. They offer habitat for termites, woodpeckers, and that when they fall, they also contribute to the soil. So dead trees are part of the system, and they are not to be messed around with. We leave the dead trees as they are, or even dying trees. But if the site is degraded, we do try and bring it back by removing weeds and putting the right species. As far as possible, we try to grow them from seeds rather than taking seedlings. Because if you take a seedling from one place and plant it elsewhere, there is some root shock and the plants can be affected or not established well. And there's always the question is, where are you taking the seedling from? Would it have grown into a tree where it was in the first place, and is it better to leave it there rather than bring it here? So that's the sort of approach that we have used.
Okay, thank you. I'll request Kalyani to ask a question. Kalyani, you are around? A question essentially is, how did you manage the growth of invasive lantana species? As we all know, it's a highly invasive species and is present in almost every forest type in India. Did they grow back after being removed?
Yeah, Lantana in some of our sites were very dense. However, the areas that we work in is quite small, and like Shankar was mentioning in his part of the talk, we do remove lantana carefully by making sure that whatever else might be regenerating within it is protected. So we remove only lantana, we first cut them, and then we also uproot them from these sites. They do come back because there is a lot of seeds in the seed bank in the soil. But since we continue to maintain these sites for a couple of years after we've cleared initially and then planted, it dwindles down, it goes down. And once the canopy cover comes in, the rigor of growth of lantana is much subdued and it's much less, and eventually it may go out. However, if there are areas around your restoration sites which still has lantana will keep coming back. But if there is a good canopy cover and your forest ecosystem has regenerated well, lantana will not be able to come back there because they need a certain amount of moisture and sunlight. And if the sun, in a rainforest, once the sunlight is cut off by canopy growth, then the lantanas more or less disappear.
Okay, thank you. Valerie, if you want to go ahead and ask your question, please.
Hi, I'm Valerie. I'm actually doing my PhD in urban ecology and, based out of Delhi. I've often heard Pradeep Krishan mention as well that we have a very small group of species that we are planting in our cities, and we need to bring in, and I'm wondering, is it possible to bring in more native species from our forests, including the Western Ghats, whether it's trees or shrubs or herbs, into our urban areas, which are really rapidly expanding spaces right now? And do you think they will do well? And how do we select the species that we bring into our urban areas? But more than that, and this goes back to something that you mentioned earlier, Divya, that how do we also create an appreciation for these species? Because as people, we are so used to seeing the exotic species around us, and our aesthetics are tuned to them. And so what we, native species look different. They have a beauty of their own. And I think a lot of times people refuse or don't want to plant native species because they think they are ugly. So how do we create that appreciation, and how do we bring in more of these species into our urban areas? Would that be a good way to, also conserve some of these species? Do you think so?
So, so where do I start? There's a lot of questions there. I think to answer your first question, where you say, can we bring more forest species into urban areas? I would be very cautious about it. I think everybody should be. Like we were mentioning, our natural ecosystems are quite limited, and it is probably not such a good idea to remove things from there in order to beautify, even with native species, urban areas. So it is important, depending on which urban area you're working in, to find something that is local. And as ecologists, when we say local, the scale is really small. It is like almost immediately surrounding it, or the nearest similar habitat. So you need to know the topography, you need to know the climatic conditions and where similar forests occur, and then you try to figure out what the species are. So I would dread it if Western Ghats species were brought to Bangalore because they look beautiful. And I think that would affect whatever is there in the Western Ghats. But having said that, there are species that are fairly widely distributed. And, and these are some of the species. And even with that, we can increase the diversity of species that can be grown in urban areas as well. So, and I think, fortunately, in more recent times, we have much more information of species distributions and where all they can be found, and therefore, easily you would find at least 2,000 species that can be planted anywhere across the country, for example. But even if you find the most beautiful species in the rainforest of Western Ghats, it's probably not a good idea to plant it in Delhi or Nagpur or Bangalore or Mysore. And so that is one thing.
Yeah, I think if you look at most of the Indian cities, you have either some very interesting natural areas within the city or very close by. Delhi has the Ridge, Bombay has Sanjay Gandhi, Bangalore has, say, Bannerghatta National Park, and other protected areas close by in the Hills and so on. So, and if you did go into those areas, you would find that easily over 100 tree species and many other plant species that are very attractive. Wild jasmines, wild balsams, the beautiful semal trees, the Arjun trees, and so on. So it should be possible for you to identify lovely native trees which are suitable for that region, for that ecosystem. It may take a little bit of effort. I think there are groups now in the restoration community which are trying to come up with lists of species that will make this job easier when someone is interested. But if you're interested, you can, with a little bit of effort, you can find what those species are. And it's a wonderful set of species you will find for almost any Indian city that you can think of.
Yeah, and also, like I was again mentioning, going back to Pradeep's example of Rajoda Park, even with the native species, and I think with your sense of aesthetics as landscapers, to weave it into the places that you're working in can make it look beautiful. And I think once you plant it in a certain way, in a particular way, and also highlight to people, because people might see them only in certain seasons, but if you do have information guides which show them flowering or fruiting or something using that plant, people might begin to appreciate these native trees and native species as well. It's like most of these species are flowering plants.
Yeah.
So it's just that you need to see them at the right time.
There's also interesting research in recent times which asks this question: as if you have a completely built up area, if you have a built up area with a little bit of greenery, but it's just typical greenery, lawn, a few trees, or an avenue of trees, straight line, versus something that looks a little more natural.
Wild.
It's a little wild. It doesn't look neat. You don't have straight lines. You have different colors of green leaves, different sizes of leaves. And it actually has psychological benefits as well, besides the biodiversity benefits, which are very clear to us. People who live there tend to be feel better, they are calmer, they're often in better health, including mental health. So it can have a lot of benefits for if landscape architects start thinking on those lines. And because that's what nature is. Nature, and when we say something is wild, it's a little unruly. It's sort of doing its own thing, and it's not something to be afraid of or to push away. It's to see how we can incorporate that into our surroundings and be comfortable with.
Well, maybe I'll see these are the last questions here, so I'll wrap up here. It's been a lovely 2 hours, and I encourage. I thank you for encouraging us to be unruly and to finding a wild side. I think that is a wonderful encouragement for landscape architects who are only too precise and always trying to get things in order. So with that, I would like to thank both of you for joining us and for Mr. Pradeep Krishan for organizing it. And I would like him to close it with telling us a little bit about what else is coming up in the next few weeks